here at the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies. I want to welcome you if you haven't been to this building before to see an exhibit, to do research, or to come to a program much like the one that we're here for tonight. There are 3 special collections libraries that live in this space, and as I said, I work for the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies, and it is appropriate that we are the co-sponsor for this event this evening, because our namesake for the building and the namesake for the library where I work, Senator Russell, is a long supporter of debate and an excellent proponent of this, do you think of it as an art or a science? Maybe a little of both. And so he would be delighted, I'm sure he would be delighted to be here if he was still with us. A few things that I want to mention. There is, as a practical matter, a cord that is over here. So if you are getting up sort of quickly to sort of move out of the space here, do mind the cord that is plugged in here. I've never worked, I didn't have any idea what this table was, so you can tell that I'm not a debater. I thought maybe it had something to do with our recording here, but as you can see, I admit my ignorance here. So I want to acknowledge a couple of guests that are here with us tonight. We have Charles Campbell, who is a former Georgia debater, but he is also with the Russell Foundation, so it's wonderful to have him here tonight. Also, the director of the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies, Cheryl Vogt, who, and I don't know if you've ever had a debate career. Not a formal debate career. Well, I'm going to let us get right over to the program because I know we have debaters here who are raring to go, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Panetta.
Appreciate everybody coming tonight. I'll start with a quick logistical issue. For those of you that are here as part of your public speaking education to go to speaking events, we'll have some sign-out sheets for you. At the end of the day, they'll be broken into 4 sections based upon the name of your instructor, and I'll go over all that at the end of the event itself. We've structured a debate so it'll take about an hour. An actual competitive debate would be more along the lines of an hour and a half. These are 4 representatives of the Georgia Debate Union who receive scholarship support from the Richard B. Russell Foundation. The debate program at the university is a strong one. There's a national debate tournament, much like the NCAA tournament. And the Georgia debate team has qualified for 25 consecutive years to have a team in the top 80. And this year we qualified 2 teams that were in the top 80, so it's a significant accomplishment by our students. The debaters debate a topic for the whole year. This year's topic was control of presidential war powers. What you're going to see tonight is just a fragment of the thousands of pages of research and hundreds of hours of work and hopefully a few hundred hours of fun as well that our students had over the course of the year. The topic that they're going to debate tonight is resolved. Executive branch targeted killing authority should be substantially restricted. For those of you that don't spend a lot of time in this, you're about to hear a debate about whether or not the president should have the authority to use drones on populations in other countries, and they may even talk about populations in this country. The affirmative team will support that resolution. And the first affirmative speaker is going to be Maggie Davis. Your program indicates that she's a junior at the university who qualified for the national debate tournament and is a valued member of our program. Her partner is the second affirmative, who's a sophomore, Robert Gallerstein, who is a 2-time attendee at the national debate tournament and is another strong member of our program as well. The negative team, the first negative is our freshman Tucker Boyce, who is a welcome addition to the squad this year. We've had a lot of fun with Tucker. And finally, in his last debate as a member of the University of Georgia's team is senior Sham Shankar. Sham is a 3-time qualifier for the national debate tournament. He is the outgoing president of the Georgia Debate Union, and he is a really, really wonderful person. I'm going to miss having him around next year. He's a good man. So the format will be that Maggie will deliver a 5-minute speech followed by a 2-minute cross-examination, and then I'll introduce each speaker as they come up.
Before I start my speech, I'd just like to speak on behalf of all of us here. I want to say thank you to the Richard B. Russell Foundation for supporting debate and helping host this event, as well as Dr. Panetta and the Georgia Debate Union for also helping support this event, and to our amazing coaching staff for being great throughout the year and, before this public debate for helping us prepare. And you, the audience, for coming and watching us. Robert and I advocate a restriction over the president's ability to use targeted killing in war. There are many reasons why drone strikes should be reduced. The first reason is that the increased reliance on drone strikes in our warfighting violates international law over the use of force and is the largest factor in terrorist recruitment efforts. Terrorism can only remain strong through recruitment efforts, and drones are the perfect propaganda tool for al-Qaeda. The drone strikes are not only causing a decline in the United States' credibility in the international arena, but it's causing a decline in the legitimacy of the controlling governments of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iraq. This causes long-term unsustainability in the way that the United States conducts war. Audrey Cronin, a professor of public policy at George Mason University and the author of How Terrorism Ends, Understanding the Decline and Demise of Terrorist Campaigns, wrote last August, "Drone strikes are undermining Washington's goal of destroying al-Qaeda. Targeted killings have not undermined propaganda efforts or recruitment. Not only has al-Qaeda's propaganda continued uninterrupted by drone strikes, it has been significantly enhanced by them. The propaganda branch of al-Qaeda has been able to attract resources by broadcasting footage of drone strikes. The strikes end up killing enemies of the Pakistani, Somali, and Yemeni militaries who may not threaten the United States at all. Repression wiped out terrorist groups in Argentina, Brazil, Peru, and Russia, but in each case, it sharply eroded the government's legitimacy. Repression is costly and difficult for democracies to sustain over time. Military repression often results in violence spreading to neighboring countries or regions, which explains the expanding al-Qaeda footprint. And this causes a dangerous arms race involving global access to drones as industrialized countries such as Russia, China, Pakistan, and India all model the actions of the United States. This destroys deterrence as well as the stability of the U.S. interests in these countries, which could cause multiple scenarios for conflict among nations over drone use. Michael Boyle, an assistant professor of political science at LaSalle, wrote in International Affairs in 2013, 76 countries have acquired UAV technology, including Russia, China, Pakistan, and India. With demand growing, states have begun the aggressive selling of drones. America's ability to control the sale will be diminished. Other states will use drones in a way that are inconsistent with U.S. interests. Many of the traditional concepts which have underwritten stability in the international system will be reshaped by drone technology. Stability is driven by deterrence. One could imagine two rival states, for example, India and Pakistan, deploying drones to test each other's capability and resolve with untold consequences. Drones erode the deterrent relationship that exists between nuclear powers, magnifying the risk of a conflict and lead to armed confrontation. The United States has set a dangerous precedent. Drones have the capacity to strengthen the surveillance capacity of authoritarian regimes with significant consequences for civil liberties. The second reason that you should prefer our advocacy is to preserve United States legitimacy and military power. According to Greg Kennedy, a professor of strategic foreign policy at King's College, our reliance on drones is also destroying the legitimacy of the United States abroad due to questions over control of the weapons, the violation of international law, and the violation of sovereignty. This guarantees the decline in military effectiveness and diplomacy in the long run. He says, the impact of unresolved legitimacy issues will have repercussions for American foreign and military policies. The United States risks incurring longer-term costs to its alliances, global public opinion, and the war on terrorism and international stability. Third, you should evaluate drones under a moral framework. Drone strikes killed hundreds of civilians each year who are not connected to terrorist networks in any way. This practice without oversight or restriction on power justifies infinite forms of state violence. Drone strikes are also unethical because they technologize warfighting in a way that makes soldiers invisible. Ian Shaw, professor at the School of Geographical and Earth Studies at the University of Glasgow, writes, "Once upon a time, targeted killings were anti-ethical to the American way of war. Targeted killings have become so normalized. This suggests the changing method of state violence, the decentralization of targeted killings. The borders of the global war on terror expanded. The aim is to grasp the consequences of this dronification of U.S. national security. A Terminator planet is no longer science fiction fantasy. Drone operators control a fleet of robots that can loiter above the landscape with advanced sensing capabilities. The instinct to technologicize and distance their killing power has become the dominant ethos of U.S. military culture. Hundreds of civilians have died in undeclared war. The drone program continues to swell and spread, burying the division between military and civilian violence. The details remain in secrecy. American citizens can be executed by their own government without judicial process on the basis of standards and evidence that are kept secret. The persons eliminated exist as digital profiles across a network of technologies. Thus, the United States federal government should increase statutory restrictions on the war power authority of the President of the United States in the area of targeted killing."
So I'd like to start by talking about your arms race arguments that Professor Boyle is making.
Okay.
I've read this article, and it seems to suggest that when the U.S. developed drones, or started developing drones, it started causing other countries like China and Russia to start developing those forms of technology.
Yeah.
I'm curious why stopping developing that technology means those countries will stop.
The key thing to recognize here is that the United States military activity normalizes military activity globally. So if the United States were to stop using those technologies, there's reason to believe that other countries willing to cooperate with the United States would also decrease those technologies.
So
but
I guess why would they have an interest in stopping? I mean,
Well-
it seems like they have a military interest in having this technology.
Well, they may have a military interest in having the technology, but they also have trade interests in being cooperative with the United States. The second argument I also wanted to make, though, was that it's a question of what type of drones these countries have, and there's a distinction between surveillance and attack drones. And most countries just have simple surveillance drones rather than attack drones that can carry out things like signature strikes and military
I guess,
activities.
Why wouldn't they just be able to develop attack drones? It seems like China is pretty sophisticated when it comes to technology.
Right, China is pretty sophisticated when it comes to technology, that's true, but they don't have those drones now. If the United States were to posture backwards rather than forwards, it's just a reason why these countries wouldn't be incentivized to create attack drones.
Okay, what's the strategy? You make a couple arguments about how drones cause some form of resentment, which increases terrorist recruitment. I guess after we decrease drones, what's the strategy for fighting?
We don't necessarily think that there is a solution or strategy to terrorism. We think that terrorism is a phenomenon that is deeply rooted in United States historical military activity that can't.
Kill terrorists overseas.
We don't. Well, it's just there are obviously other strategies that the United States could use, like counterterrorism, counterinsurgency strategies that don't involve drones.
After restricting drones would be things like special operations.
No, not necessarily. I mean, we're not inconsistent with things like special operations being decreased.
So the affirmative team has made an argument why we should restrict drones. At the end of the debate, we're going to do a poll about which side you think won the debate. Part of judging a debate is not what your own opinion is on this. It's based on what you've heard, which of these teams did a better job. So you've heard the initial case. At the end of the debate, I'll poll you whether you think the resolution is true, and if you think so, that means the affirmative won the debate, or whether the resolution is not true, and it has been proven to be false, and then that will be a vote for the negative. The next speech in the debate is the first negative constructive, and the speaker is Pepper Boyd.
The affirmative advocates that we must reduce the executive's authority to utilize targeted killing operations. We believe that there are 3 reasons that this should not be the case. First, drone strikes are an effective method of disabling terror operations overseas and do not generate significant resentment. Second, the alternatives to using drone strikes endanger American lives and generate worse forms of backlash from the global community. And third, that U.S. drone policy is not the reason that there is currently a global drones arms race. Let's begin with our first point of contention. The use of drone strikes by the executive branch has been wildly successful at dismantling overseas terror operations before those groups can execute complex attacks against the United States and our allies. Drone use achieves multiple strategic objectives for the United States military. Organizations never generate sufficient organizational strength to be a threat to our interests when we have the capability to deploy forces at their doorstep. It disrupts plots and allows us to target their leadership so that we can hit them where it hurts the most. Plus, it risks 0 American lives in the process. As Kenneth Anderson, a professor of international law at American University, stated, quote, "Drone warfare offers an unparalleled means to strike directly at terrorist organizations without needing a conventional or counterinsurgency approach to reach terrorist groups in their safe havens. It offers an offensive capability rather than simply defensive measures such as homeland security alone. Drone warfare offers a raiding strategy directly against those terrorists and their leadership. Drone warfare is just one element of overall strategy, but it has a clear utility in disrupting terrorist leadership. It makes planning and execution of complex plots difficult, if only impossible, because it is hard to plan for years down the road if you have some reason to think that you'll be struck down by a drone but have no idea when. The unpredictability and terrifying anticipation of sudden attack, which terrorists have acknowledged in communications, have a significant impact on planning and organizational effectiveness. Additionally, the affirmative's argument that drones and civilian casualties that are associated with their use and further terrorist recruitment is simply not the case. This is simply speculation on the part of many. In many of the regions that we use drones, resentment towards the United States was high well before we ever deployed drone technology to those regions. While certainly the United States should do as much as we can to reduce the number of innocent civilian casualties that drone strikes do sometimes generate, there is no evidence that eliminating the drone program would alleviate resentment overseas. As Amitai Etzioni, professor of international relations at George Washington, puts it, quote, critics argue that drone strikes alienate the population and thus help al-Qaeda's recruitment, generating more terrorists than they killed. These statements, which may at first seem as obviously true, are not supported by data. In fact, the resentment of the United States has many sources, and this resentment was high before drones were used and is high in several nations in the Middle East where drones were never used in the first place. This brings us to our second point, that the alternatives to drones are much worse. Absent totally disengaging ourselves from these regions, the alternative is often to the use of ground troops, such as special operations forces that an organization like the CIA would deploy. However, the use of ground troops are seen by many as violating the sovereignty of countries and would certainly bring more international backlash. It will also put many U.S. personnel at risk every single time that we have to put troops on the ground, even if those are in small numbers. As Michael Lewis, a professor who teaches international law and the law of war at Ohio University's College of Law, puts it, quote, any alternative use of force against the Taliban or al-Qaeda forces would be likely to cause many more civilian casualties. Even if drones continue to cause some civilian casualties and have other negative effects, the question of whether continuing the drone program is a good policy decision cannot be answered without carefully considering the alternatives that are available. This brings us to our final point. U.S. drone policy is not the reason that other countries are acquiring drone technology, and stopping our use of drones would do nothing to encourage our adversaries to do the same. While it is true that the United States has primarily started this so-called drones arms race, this does not mean that we can do anything to stop it. Drone technology offers superior technology advances to militaries across the world. It offers a new method of surveillance and combat. This technology is not going to go away. White, a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, has said, quote, a great many other countries are getting into the drone game too, but this is less because the United States is paving the way than because this logic is obvious to other countries too. If anything, this seems to be a reason for the U.S. to stay ahead militarily in terms of both drone technology and our ability to use those drones.
Alright, so this Sony quote that you read states that resentment was high against the United States before drones were used. What type of resentment was this, and why were terrorist groups resentful?
Because of previous policies that the United States operated in the Middle East, for example, during the Persian Gulf War, before we ever deployed drones, there was already a hatred of the United States in some of those countries.
Intervention, civilian casualties, all things that seem to be reflective of our current drone policy. Do you have
So-
a historical example of when there was terrorist resentment to the United States in a world where we weren't intervening somewhere?
It's a question of whether or not those terrorist resentments were caused by drones or not, which means that your point proves our argument, which is that if we were to reduce the amount of drones, it would not suddenly mean that all Middle Eastern countries that currently hate us would love us, because there are other things that cause
so your
that
argument is
backlash.
basically just like there's already resentment there, so we have to kill the terrorists.
Well, the argument is that drones are not the key to
Okay,
that
that's
resentment.
fine. So you read a quote that says that terrorists are in a constant state of fear of being attacked, like at any time, no matter where, a drone could just come and strike them. Why is that fear and anxiety limited to only the militants? Wouldn't someone like a civilian walking down the street also be afraid of them?
Well, the argument is that A, there's not enough, or there's not a lot of civilian casualties, and B, that fear doesn't apply because those civilians have no reason to fear attack because they're not planning terrorist attacks against the United States.
Okay, so basically the key question here is, are there a high number of civilian casualties?
I mean, that could be one
If we
question.
prove that there are a high number of civilian casualties, then they would also be afraid of drones.
Well, also our evidence says that the alternative to that, if we reduce drone use, would be to use
Okay,
those
I actually
forces
wanna
which
talk
cause
about
more
that. Why do
casualties.
ground troops translate to civilian casualties?
Um,
Do you have like statistics that say here's how many civilians are?
Yeah, Michael Lewis actually went through this. It's an international law
Michael Lewis
professor.
stuff, it doesn't give any numbers.
I don't think he has like hard numbers because we have not shifted to those things, but there have been empirical examples where we use special operations forces and they also killed civilians.
But like there's no like comparative. It's just like
He definitely makes a
certain-
comparative claim. He says even if drones continue, other things will cause them.
The next speech in the debate is the second affirmative constructive. One difference, hopefully, you're seeing between a debate and an argument is that in a debate, you do have to directly respond to the arguments that are made by your opponent. You don't like duck off into another issue. And hopefully you're seeing that they actually have to have read the material of the opponent before they understand it to be making the arguments. And that behavior you should see mapped out in the rest of the speeches. And Robert Walsh is literally the second affirmative constructive.
So unfortunately for the United States, the practice of drone warfare serves as the ideal propaganda tool for al-Qaeda. While there are no longer ground troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, many veterans of these conflicts, members of the al-Qaeda organization, still exist in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and actively use targeted killings and drone strikes as a means to recruit people to their organization. Al-Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula, to give you a particular example, discusses the wrongful deaths associated with targeted killings on a monthly journal called Inspire Magazine, which is published in English, and you can actually go read if you're so interested. They even have sort of YouTube videos and things to actively recruit Middle Eastern and American people into the organization, which they have done in the past successfully. This sort of long-term strategy is unsustainable. When we invade a country like Pakistan or even Somalia and don't ask for consent, we harm their legitimacy, and even our own president, President Obama, is not consulted on the particulars of the majority of these drone strikes in places like Yemen. The covert authority rests with the CIA, and there's no publishing mechanism to even discuss how many drone strikes we did in a particular year, who was killed wrongfully, who was killed rightfully, which is why it's very difficult to determine sort of when a civilian was killed in the first place, because the United States is not telling us anything. We use signature strikes where a specific target is not even known. We just assume that a particular area is dangerous, a particular group of characteristics, and we strike it when we do not know the target and kill people nonetheless. There's no mechanism for reviewing the wrongful deaths. There's no mechanism for compensating victims and families to discuss grievances. The United States gives the international community nothing. Although the international development of drones may to a certain extent be inevitable, the United States must make sure to take the lead in regulating this practice and set rules for the road. The United States is currently the only nation that exercises the authority to use targeted killing externally, and it's actively setting a precedent for how this unregulated technology will be used in the future. Whether it will be governed the same way that other forms of warfare are governed in international law, where before a country is invaded, you either have to declare war or achieve their consent, or whether it just becomes a sort of new category that is completely unregulated. Attempting to always gain sort of a military advantage vis-a-vis other countries like China and Russia is exactly what spurs sort of these arms races and new technologies, and disallows for cooperation over rules and standards over how sort of these technological developments will be deployed in the first place. When the United States is constructing its foreign policy, a theme that like the affirmative would like to bring up, sort of a broader theme for the debate, is that we should attempt to move away from sort of neoconservative involvement that's been emphasized in the last 40 years. What started as direct military interventions in first Vietnam and Korea, then became interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, is now being reinstituted by Obama in whatever way possible through the practice of targeted killing. The very fact that no Americans die from this is sort of the problem, is because we view these risks as a completely no-cost option. The United States is willing to send a drone over to a foreign territory and kill people no matter what, because no U.S. troops dying, no matter how right or wrong that kill was in the first place. Unfortunately, active participation in the war is not something that we should really be actively distanced from, but something that we should really feel the lived cost, so that we know if we were wanting to intervene in a particular pace, we would sort of have our own costs associated with it, instead of externalizing all of them. The ultimate withdrawal from Vietnam and Iraq was largely prompted by movements in favor of nonviolence, groups that pushed for bringing the troops back home and played to sort of patriotic audience. I worry that sort of this realization will never happen with drones, because we'll leave it entirely unquestioned. People don't sort of seem to care about it in the same way, because, you know, the innocent civilians that are being killed are just not our own. It becomes like, and we just decapitate leaders that are constantly being replaced, kill innocent civilians in the process, and it becomes essentially like cutting the grass on a lawn full of weeds, where eventually you need to find some method of resolving the problem, otherwise the weeds are just going to grow back. There is quantitative evidence supporting our claims to sort of refute the 1 and C claims. The human rights and global justice groups at Stanford and NYU did a 9-month-long investigative study and interviewed hundreds of victims, witnesses, and experts from Pakistan and Yemen. And unlike many U.S. reports, they did characterize they characterized drones as something that is not surgically precise and has a lot of collateral damage, and that their presence is something that's constantly thought about and is being used actively as a tool for recruitment in Al-Qaeda. We should sort of abandon the entire idea that this problem of terrorism is solvable. We have been hearing constantly across the last 40 years that Al-Qaeda is on the run and nearing defeat, but yet different organizations keep popping back up. We recognize that drones are not the worst option available in the United States military arsenal. A direct intervention like Vietnam or Iraq would be worse, but that being said, we think the negative has presented you with a false choice. More violent forms of military intervention are always bad, and in reality, we should attempt to move away from all these forms of military intervention.
So, minus drones, what is the short-term strategy to stop terrorist groups?
To stop terrorist groups?
Yes.
We don't think that terrorism is something that we can sort of solve if we are constantly...
So
the short-term strategy should be one that tries to attack the root of the problem. Like, we think that this is a long-term problem, and that terrorism will inevitably pop up in particular.
What is attacking the root of the problem?
Attacking the root of the problem means examining what United States policies are exactly what are creating resentment and
Well,
recruitment for these...
in order to prevent groups that are currently, we have intelligence that says that Al-Qaeda is currently planning attacks against the United States. What do we do in the next 5 years to resolve that?
We attempt to, one particular example we think is we should stop striking populations in other countries with drones. Like, we think that's a particularly good starting point to limit sort of the terrorism that exists externally, because when the United States intervenes abroad, it just creates far more resentment by killing all these people internationally.
Guantanamo Bay, for example, there was a lot of torture that went on there. That is not ended by ending the drone policy. Why wouldn't that also cause resentment from terrorist groups, which also...
I mean, it would cause a certain degree of resentment, sure. Our entire argument is that we should move away from these sort of neoconservative foreign policies that assume that we can control the world and control the internal affairs of other states.
Does voting for you mean that you advocate that we should not have any type of foreign intervention or any type of detention policies like
We think drones are a particularly good starting point for that sort of conversation because they're exactly sort of the epitome of our current neoconservative foreign policy because they're the easiest way that Obama can exercise power without receiving public backlash.
Why haven't China and Russia already begun drone killing if your modeling arguments are true?
To a certain degree, they have prepared. They're developing UAV technology. They haven't literally started. That's our whole point. Is that we access a unique sort of point, like a temporal point where this is our opportunity that we can act to set a precedent before China starts acting. Is our argument.
The last constructive speech before the rebuttals is delivered by the negative Sham Shankar. And what you're going to find in the debate is the affirmative has to prove the resolution to be true, so they'll speak first and last. So we're about to have the second negative constructive speech followed immediately by another speech delivered by Tucker on the negative.
The question you should ask yourself in this debate is what is the affirmative strategy for dealing with the threat of foreign terrorism? It is our contention that their strategy is one of disengagement, where we wait for terrorists to come to us instead of preventing the threat before it reaches our shores. We have isolated numerous strategic advantages to the use of drones. I will briefly review them here. First, the use of drones prevents overseas organizations from developing sufficient organizational strength to be a threat to our interests, whether it be the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, or any of their affiliates. Drones disrupt plots and allow us to target their leadership, so we can hit them where it hurts them the most. As Professor Anderson was quoted earlier, drone warfare gives us an offensive capability where we target their leadership to prevent these organizations from ever becoming effective. Second is that it creates a deterrent effect. Imagine planning and executing a complex plot against your enemy if you know at any point you might be struck from a drone from the sky. It makes it difficult, as terrorists have already confirmed for us in communications we've intercepted. Third is that drones also significantly undermine recruitment efforts. As Daniel Byman, a professor in the Security Studies program at Georgetown University, puts it, drones have also undercut terrorists' ability to communicate and to train new recruits. In order to avoid attracting drones, Al-Qaeda and Taliban operatives try to avoid using electronic devices or gathering in large numbers. Leaders, however, cannot give orders when they are incommunicado, and training on a large scale is nearly impossible when a drone strike could wipe out an entire group of new recruits. Now, the affirmative's argument that drones are increasing terrorism through civilian casualty is simply not true. There's no empirical data to suggest so. In fact, what we do know suggests that there's no causal connection. While the U.S. should do all it can to reduce civilian casualties from drone strikes, eliminating our use of drones isn't going to magically solve the terrorist threat we face. It existed before we used drones and will continue to exist if we stop. Statistics that we have referenced earlier from Amitai Etzioni, a professor of international relations, show that resentment against the U.S. was high before drones were used and is high in many nations where drones have never been used, indicating there are broader structural reasons for this animosity that they don't have a strategy to deal with. Even if they are correct that drones cause some individuals to radicalize, overall, drones prevent terrorism by killing high-level leadership and deterring plots. There's no data or analysis that goes far enough to prove every single individual in these groups have joined because of drones. It's factually true there are some radical jihadists who would have joined those organizations regardless, and we need to have a strategy of dealing with them. With regards to civilian casualties, as I mentioned earlier, we agree that civilian casualties should decrease. And as drone technology advances, we'll be able to develop new, more precise methods to decrease those. As Michael Cohen, a fellow at the Century Foundation, says, the percentage of civilians dying in drone strikes is also falling, which suggests that U.S. drone operators are showing far greater care in trying to limit collateral damage. Now, with regard to their arms race arguments, it is pretty clear U.S. drone policy is not the reason other countries are requiring drone technology. They are requiring it because it provides them significant military benefits. While it is true that the U.S. has primarily started this so-called drones arms race, that does not mean we can do anything to stop it. Drone technology offers a new method of surveillance and combat, and it places zero troops at risk. As was quoted by Benjamin Wittes earlier, the logic behind acquisition is about relative power, which means the question you should ask yourself is whether the U.S. is going to be ahead of the curve or whether we are going to be behind it. By continuing to acquire drone technology and innovating, the U.S. can militarily stay ahead of it rather than letting our adversaries, such as Russia and China, have more military sophistication. Now, they make a couple of arguments about Iraq and Afghanistan, but I think this analogy doesn't really apply. Drone use isn't the same thing as Iraq and Afghanistan. We aren't sending a whole army to overthrow a foreign government. We are targeting specific individuals that are known to be terrorists in order to kill them. This also isn't Vietnam, because we're not trying to overthrow a government. We're literally using precise drone strikes to kill specific individuals in a region. They say terrorism isn't solvable, but this is our argument. The fact that affiliates like AQAP and AQIM keep popping up across the region is a reason why we need to continuously engage with them in order to prevent them from ever becoming a threat to our interests.
Okay, so I guess my question is, you kind of consistently ask us, how do we solve terror? Like, what sort of counter-terror policy do we implement? My question to you is, like, it sort of redirects that back at you. How can we quantitatively say that drones are decreasing terrorism?
Well, we've quoted numerous professors.
Give qualitative arguments.
No. We've made quotes that were qualitative, but the data that they use.
Statistically study members of Al-Qaeda, an organization that doesn't publish a budget report.
Well, I mean, we have statistics on how many high-level leaders we've killed. We have communications that show that they are afraid of drones.
Since 2004, 2007, largely, I guess, in Yemen, 2009 with Obama, the examples you give, Al-Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula, Al-Qaeda Islamic Movement in Algeria, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Boko Haram, all of these groups have popped up since we started using drones.
Yeah.
That thing?
Well,
like Al-Qaeda on the
not
Arabian
necessarily.
Peninsula wasn't a big problem until around 2009.
Well,
when we
I think
started
you have to
targeting
consider the
them.
structural reasons why they have popped up in different regions. We started increasing drones at first in certain regions targeted against the core aspect of Al Qaeda. And once we started decimating them, they moved to different regions in order to try to evade us. And now we are shifting in order to counter that.
Like an organization like Al-Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula, ACAP, we use drones in Yemen. Now they're moving to Somalia. Should we now just start using drones there too?
I mean, if there's a
Once they
high-level
move to
terrorist threat
Ethiopia,
to
should
the,
we start using drones there too?
if
Like,
there's
where
a-
does it stop?
well,
When are
we're
we gonna
we're not
solve the
targeting
problem?
civilians here. We're targeting specific terrorists that are threats to U.S.
Civilians
interests.
are dying, unfortunately, is the problem. Okay, I guess my other question is that should one state be able to violate another sovereign state's territory without their consent?
Well, I think the premise of your question, which I think you're getting at, is I disagree that drones do violate that sovereignty. A lot of countries do cooperate with us over drone strikes, like Pakistan, for example.
So now we move to rebuttal phase. The first native rebuttal is Freeman's speech. And he's going to cover some of the material that was in his previous speech, but wasn't covered by Sean in the last Freeman speech.
In this speech, I will address our second point, which is that the alternatives to drone use are actually a worse option. We believe that a discussion of whether or not drones are an effective tool is incomplete without addressing what other tools we would use if we did not have the ability to use drones. If we did not use drones, we would have to at some point endanger American lives to fight terrorism or completely disengage from protecting our national interests. Drones help save American lives, providing intelligence and creating automated combat that does not need American boots on the ground. Using ground troops would be specifically even worse. Lewis's article continues, quote, "If operations in Afghanistan are any guide, using ground troops will result in as many or more civilian casualties than the current drone campaign, it would be more deeply unpopular. Thus, it seems that drones offer a more precise means of fighting terrorists overseas without harming U.S. personnel." The cross-examination of the last speech also brought up a point about foreign governments. Decommitting our drone forces would actually mean that we could not help foreign governments. Pakistan specifically is unstable and has many problems with their internal government structure. The United States is able to reconcile these differences with both the government so that we're able to cooperate to solve terrorist groups by deploying drones and being cooperative in military ventures. Absent the use of drones, the Pakistani government would probably be taken over by extremist groups due to an inability to limit out those operations. Lewis, a professor who teaches international law, has said, quote, "Ceding the territory to Taliban control would provide the Afghan Taliban with a safe haven from which to continue its operations against American and Afghan forces across the border. The second option would be for Pakistan's military to assert control over the region. However, its last serious attempt to do so, the Swat Valley campaign of 2009, utilized armored vehicles and artillery. This resulted in the displacement of more than 1 million civilians who fled the military and army's indiscriminate firepower." Now, they also say that this is a false choice. But as policymakers, we should look at both our entire war strategy and the limiting use of drones. This argument puts them in a double bind that they have to choose. Either A, we do actually abandon all of our strategies to fight terrorism, which makes all of the arguments that Sham just talked about in the previous speech much stronger. That would cause us to eliminate special operations and ground forces too, according to the affirmative, and literally do nothing. Or B, we still have to rely on some type of strategy and alternatives to fight terrorism, which means that those things would still fail. Their argument is similar to turning off the electricity to a house because it leads to pollution without thinking about how to turn the lights on in the short term. The affirmative says that we should step back, but it's a flawed argument because there are terrorist attacks that are currently being planned that we cannot afford to retreat from. Even if the long-term strategy means that we should reevaluate how we view terrorism, we cannot simply retreat now because that would lead to more terrorist strikes on both the United States and our allies.
The next speech in the debate is the first affirmative rebuttal. One of the things that we try to do in debate is teach people argument selection and word economy, and we do this by the forced nature of this speech. The negative is just delivered 8 minutes worth of arguments with no affirmative response. And Maggie Davis is going to give a 3-minute rebuttal in which she can be expected to crystallize 8 minutes of argument.
If the question of the debate is truly the threat of terrorism, we present the best advocacy to solve terrorism in the long term. Drones don't necessarily solve leadership or deterrence. These all assume that there is one group of terrorists. Like Robert said, terrorism doesn't just up and end when we kill X number of terrorists or do X number of drone strikes. Terrorism evolves with every single action that the United States does, and this was proven in Crossex when Tucker said that resentment from terrorism only began when the United States was intervening in the Gulf War. It's evolving, and killing one leader causes a resentment chain that just leads to other factions. Their agreement with us proves that the use of drones leads to endless warfare, which is not necessarily something that we should be advocating. We should reject the neoconservative ideology that we need to be intervening endlessly. Drone strikes are the key recruiting tool for al-Qaeda, and they're the reason why terrorism is never ending. The negative argument assumes that militants who we kill are just terrorists. They are also brothers, sons, friends, members of society, and this is clearly what is causing resentment. You should look at the terrorism debate as short-term versus long-term, which is clearly what this has come down to, and you should prefer the long-term solution. Yes, we may temporarily disrupt leadership plots with drones, but we are not stopping resentment against the United States in the long run. Neither side believes that terrorism is a solvable threat. They have even stated that organizational structures of terrorist groups are not strong enough right now. They have not stated that certain terrorist attacks will occur with a reduction of drones, so there's no reason why you should vote for this anyway. If the negative is correct in saying that drones are so widely successful, you have to ask yourself, why is terrorism still so strong then? This is because drones that kill civilians and militant groups unrelated to the war on terrorism cause massive resentment and is used as a tool for terrorist groups to gain recruits. Here you have to think of yourself. If another country were flying drones that could kill you over your head daily and were striking areas around Atlanta and Athens, you would begin to feel angry and you would feel like you wanted to change that threat to your life. The key framing argument is that terrorism will not end in its current state. It only stops. It's only if the United States stops these forms of policies. Civilian casualties are what causes this resentment. Even if we don't win the collateral damage of drone strikes fuels terrorism, this fact alone is a reason to morally reject the use of drones. Civilian casualties are rampant, and this isn't just speculation. The number of civilians is often underestimated rather than overestimated because our drone policy is strategically kept in secrecy. Just yesterday, Reuters reported a dozen civilians killed in a recent strike in Yemen, and does an analysis that states that 3 of every 10 people that are killed are civilians. The nature of not knowing the number of deaths goes our way. It's a reason why we shouldn't trust the policy. Now their special operations argument. This argument represents a flawed reasoning in the form of a false choice. We shouldn't be forced to choose between ground troops and drones because we're just saying that targeted killing is an extension of warfare of the 21st century, which we reject. Our advocacy is not contradictory to saying that we should not use ground troops. We agree. We shouldn't orient our policies to other nations to attempt to solve random forms of sectarian violence. There's no double bind here. We don't say do nothing. We just say that our ideology is consistent and that this could lead to a future drawdown of ground troops into any intervention. Also, there's an argument that they have an answer, which is just that special operations are only used on occasion and aren't as fully integrated.
The negative will deliver their last speech. In this speech, Sham is supposed to crystallize the reasons to vote for the negative. It's been destroyed.
The question that is most important in this debate is how we best engage with terrorists. While we believe the affirmative has pointed out potential problems with drones, as is, those are things that can be improved over time. Given we are dealing with such a new form of technology, civilian casualties can be decreased with improved intelligence and precision, an argument I made earlier. The problem is that the affirmative takes this too far. Drones are an essential element of our combat strategy against terrorist organizations overseas, and doing away with them would leave us in a more precarious position. You should ask yourselves this question: what does the affirmative hope to do to deal with the threat of terrorism? The answer, quite frankly, seems to be that we should pull ourselves back, not use ground troops, not use special forces, not use drones, and hope that these organizations magically won't attack us. The answer is insufficient. We have enemies in Al-Qaeda and its affiliates that have voiced their opposition to America and our allies. We have communications that show these organizations are trying to put together complex plots in order to attack us. And we have communications that show that those organizations are less effective right now because drone strikes are hampering their ability to effectively cooperate and execute a strike. The way we counter them is by engaging in them, not to sit idly and hope that will go away in the next 20, 30, 40 years when the threat to terrorism is still looming in the next 5 to 10 years at least. They say, well, there are multiple arguments we made. We made arguments for why drones would be effective through decapitation, through deterrence, and by undermining recruitment. Even if terrorism evolves, we shouldn't sit and do nothing. We must kill those who are immediate threats to our interests. We didn't make an argument for why terrorism can never be solved. Rather, we made an argument for why targeted killing is necessary in order to end those terrorists and prevent them from ever becoming a threat. So in effect, it solves the threat that terrorism poses to U.S. interests. They make an argument about brothers, sons, and friends, but we're not killing brothers, sons, and friends unless they're a vital threat to our interests and a terrorist. The occasional civilian casualties that occur are actually decreasing, as we've referenced through statistics, and will improve over time. They don't have a strategy in a short term, and some jihadists do exist in these regions and will join these organizations. No matter whether or not we decrease drones, they will exist. So we need to have a strategy of actually dealing with them. They make an argument about civilian casualties, but as I've said, civilian casualties are decreasing as is, and targeted killing is more precise in the status quo. You shouldn't morally reject drone strikes if it's saving American lives and preventing a new terrorist strike against the U.S. and our interests right now. It's not a false choice because they've conceded special operations would be worse, and eliminating our troops would mean these places would have more instability.
The United States has a constant desire to attempt to establish control over the international system. When there's a problem, and even when we can't solve it, we need to pat ourselves on the back and feel like we're doing something, even if we're recreating the same forms of the problem. It's impossible to truly establish causation with these issues, so I'd suggest you just look at the timeline. Al-Qaeda, although dangerous, used to be a relatively singular organization. It was an entity housed within Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now, Al-Qaeda has spread its reach far beyond those places. Al-Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula has a heavy presence in Yemen. Al-Qaeda Islamic Maghreb has a heavy presence in Algeria. Al-Shabaab has a heavy presence in Somalia. Boko Haram has almost taken over Nigeria. Since we have started increasing drone strikes under the Obama administration, all of these sort of sects of Al-Qaeda have popped up. So when we have increased drones, terror has increased. At the very least, this should tell us that decapitating a leader solves nothing, because when these terrorist organizations are planning particular attacks, all of the knowledge is not housed within one specific leader's head, but is a broader piece of information. Terrorism is intertwined with all of the United States' actions. When we collapse leaders, they simply split off into more factions and are replaced. There's no clear stopping point, because once we start doing drone strikes in places like Yemen, once they move to Somalia, what's to stop us from doing drone strikes there? What's to stop us from, once they move to India, doing drone strikes against an ally? This sort of infinite regression is exactly why we should be worried about drone strikes. It's not just killing militants. There also are large amounts of civilian casualties. And you should have a sense of empathy. Even if you didn't know a direct sort of relative that have died from one of these things, if you were to grow up in a place like North Waziristan or on the Gulf of Aden in Yemen, you would be hostile to the United States and be more sympathetic to these claims if a piece of machinery was constantly flying over your head with a piece of missile from a foreign government. That is kind of what our NYU and Stanford study confirmed when it did massive amounts of 9-month research projects and interviews with victims that sort of indicated that these things do have an impact. Even if without civilian casualties, they're exactly what allowed for recruitment for groups like Al-Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula. Civilian casualties are not even reported by the United States government, which is something that should make you skeptical. All of their claims are claims done by independent journalism, people that say it might be 30, might be 40% of civilian casualties, but we don't know, which is why you should be skeptical of the government making these decisions in the first place. The question is that they say that the problems can be solved by time, but my question is when? There appears to be no clear spatial or temporal boundary to the use of drones. There's no clear point where we would stop using them, no clear point where terrorism would be solved. If we're increasing, we shouldn't actually believe in these empty promises that civilian casualties will magically decrease. We're not able to end the terrorists, like the negative said. This won't happen. We can't continue to play Team America World Police. We should merely just try to do whatever strategy we can to sort of attack the root of the problem.
I want to thank our assistant coaches, Michaela Mollison, Logan Gramazinski, Rob Mulholland, and Will Mosley Jensen. Will's been a coach here at the university for 6 years. He's defending his PhD dissertation 2 weeks from Monday, and he's going to be a professor at Trinity University in Texas. And so we wish him well. He's done a lot of good work here. That's very nice at the university. So the debate. The question is resolved that executive branch targeted killing authority should be substantially restricted. That was the case that was made by Maggie and Robert. Based upon what you heard in the debate, if you believe the resolution to be true, raise your hand. And then the negative would be that it has not been proven true, that executive branch targeting should not be substantially restricted. If you believe that to be true, raise your hand. All right, so our audience has voted for the negative. And what we'll do is we can field a couple questions publicly, and then if people don't have public questions and want to come up and talk to them individually, we can do that, and then I'll explain to you how we're going to do the extra credit thing. Any questions you want to ask? Yeah, right over here.
Decapitation, what does that mean in this context?
Killing the high-level leader. as leadership, kind of like cutting the head off the snake, that type of thing.
I was curious as to what that meant there. But
Yeah, it's a term of art that some people use in the literature.
Other questions?
So there are lots of discussions of terrorism generally. I was wondering if the negative could articulate what they think the major threat of terrorism, what region or what organization would be most likely to be a problem in the future, the short-term future.
Well, I would say I would think there's a couple. The first is Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. In Yemen, there's a lot of literature that suggests that they're growing in strength. Even though we are drone striking them right now in order to try to quell the threat, and that they could try to attack various oil fields around the region, which would definitely hurt U.S. interests. Also, Pakistan is a potential problem because Pakistan is notorious for potentially having loose nuclear arsenals that aren't very secure, so we might want to kill the terrorists before they get them.
Okay. All right. So, who has the list A through K? All right. I want you to go over to that door. All right. I'm going to explain this to you. We need to make sure we get this right because it'll be a nightmare if we don't. We have lists of people that have signed up for extra credit, and we have them listed by the instructor, not by your name. So, for instance, we want you to go if your instructor is Anderson, all the way down to Kim. If your instructor's name starts with A through K, that's the person that you want to check out with right there, okay? So if your name is Smith and you're taking Kristen Anderson's class, you go see Mr. A through K to sign up. All right, who's got M through R?
I got M through P.
M through P, perfect. So my name's Panetta, I'm a teacher. If you had me for this, and I don't have any of my students here doing this, if you were in my class and you want to go over here, we're going to keep you away from them. So we keep everybody separated that we don't have a disaster. So if you're through M through P, if your instructor's name starts there, you go see Ms. Malson. Who has S? Okay, S is going to go over into that corner. We have literally half of the population has SAMP or Stallings or Stillian Southard. And then over here is the man that has the rest of the alphabet, T through Z. So you need to know your instructor's name, A through K, and on, and they will sign you up. Thank you, A through K over there.